My office needs some TLC, but today we're not chasing waterfalls. We're building a totally custom gaming shelf to house my classic video game collection and make it easier to access and play. So the goal of this project is to build a custom shelf that is both attractive, matches the aesthetic of the room, but also makes the games easier to get to, easier to play, and look good. So let's get started.
I want this room to have a modern, rustic, cabin-y vibe, so I'll trim these out to match what's already there. With the design sketched out and a general direction in mind, I headed outside to rip the 3/4-inch plywood down to 16-inch strips. I'm using the Craig AccuCut XL here, and it makes short work of getting these boards cut into usable pieces. I'd decided ahead of time that I wanted to use lap joints for the cubbies. I've always been a little intimidated at the idea of using lap joints like these, so I thought this would be a good project to practice and see how it goes. I cut the horizontal and the vertical rungs on the miter saw, making sure the end piece was a little longer for extra support against the wall. Like any good puzzle, I start with the outer edges to be sure they're all good before moving into the center. I countersank these screws, but I'm not too worried about filling them since this side will be pushed up against the wall. Carefully, using the digital design as a reference, I start measuring out where all the rungs will intersect with the newly built frame. Checking and rechecking, I measure out where each horizontal and vertical rung will intersect, and then mark opposite channels for the lap joint. I was really worried about getting this right the first time, so I went back and forth double and triple checking before I moved over to the miter saw to make the initial cuts. In retrospect, I should have made these a little more consistent. You can't really see it in the finished piece, but there were some tiny gaps here and there where some of the cuts were inconsistent. A useful lesson learned. After making the initial cuts of one horizontal and one vertical board on the miter saw, I pulled out the jigsaw to clean it up for the test fits. I only did one of each, just in case things went south, so I wouldn't have to completely start over. The first test fit was moderately successful, and I felt pretty confident in my ability to at least forge ahead and fix whatever minor issues would come up. So I cut the rest of the lap joints for the remaining horizontal rungs. With what will become the front of the cubbies face down on the flat table, I was able to secure the horizontal shelves using clamps and a square to keep everything straight against the lines I made earlier. To make sure everything would line up correctly on both sides, I used one of the vertical shelves to hold the spacing as I secured the second shelf. To my delight, it was dead on. So I moved that first support to the other side and started adding the rest of the vertical shelves to keep everything nice and square along the way. With the cubbies finally taking shape, I lined everything up to secure the vertical shelves with 2-inch wood screws. Starting with the top shelf, since it's a little longer to hide the wiring, I took my time to avoid missing the rungs with the holes and screws. It would be really evident if I'd missed any because a ray of light would shoot through any accidental holes into the otherwise dark cubbies. Everything was coming together so nicely. I was really proud of myself. Until I realized on the bottom I'd miscalculated and attached everything 3/4 too far to the right and to the wrong side of the wall-facing board. Not to worry though, it was easy enough to fix, and since there's no light coming up from the bottom, and I've got some other plans for that surface on a future project, the few holes I'd already drilled won't be a problem. Like I mentioned earlier, the lap joints were a little too forgiving in places. So while I still had easy access to the back of the cubbies, I shot a few nails in there to hold everything in place and prevent any slight wobble that might occur later. The bottom of the cubbies will rest on a horizontal base that I plan to attach a long power strip to. So the last thing I need to do is put some back supports in place that will be screwed into the wall studs for support at the top. I cut 3 of those and attached them inside the cubbies with nails and screws from different directions for added support. One final detail before I start the finishing and trimming. I needed to get a network of holes in all the cubbies to route the wires cleanly up to the TV and down to the power strip. I used a 1.5-inch paddle bit for this and later switched over to my right angle drill to make the process a little easier, inside the cubby. The holes are a little rough, but I've ordered rubber grommets that will drop into each hole from both sides to cover the edges and provide a cleaner look. I take a minute here to tidy up the area in preparation for the next steps. It's a shame, really. That sawdust might have helped with the disaster that awaited me. I cut these 45 angles to match the edges of my desk, and because I thought it would add a neat detail to the first part of the shelf that you see when entering the room. The top shelf was cut a little longer so that it would line up exactly with the existing trim where the TV is mounted. This should hide the wires and allow me to put a loom around them during the final setup. As usual, almost nothing ever goes exactly as planned. I started the staining process and it just didn't appear to be taking. It just wasn't soaking up. At this point though, I was committed, so I decided to finish and see if it would sort itself out. It didn't sort itself out. In fact, it got worse. What followed was a loud cackle, a guffaw, really, the likes of which could only resonate from the chest of someone who's just failed so hard that there's really no point in doing anything else. It's for the best that I wasn't wearing a mic for that shot, because the audio would have been rendered completely unusable by the steady stream of obscenities I uttered under my breath and aloud as I thought about how fun this was going to be to clean up. In the end, it was all for naught, because even after 2 coats of stain and a few hours of cleanup, it looked terrible. There were streaks everywhere, inconsistent absorption into the wood, complete lack of absorption in other places, total waste of time. I was so fired up, I completely forgot to film the next steps. I wiped everything down, cleaned it up, and remembering the sage wisdom of the Rolling Stones, I painted it black. My helper didn't want to be included in the video, so by this time, I'd taken the evening to recover and had since fallen in love with how that mistake is actually going to make this project look even cooler in the room. So I started staining and trimming out the fronts just as planned. I was back on track. While waiting for the stain to dry on those last weird corner pieces, I decided it was time to go ahead and start moving the systems up and routing the wires. And before you know it, we're in business. All in all, I'm really happy with how this turned out. I got some floor space back, it looks a ton better, and is way more organized and accessible. I even got some extension cords for the controllers so that I can play comfortably from the couch. We've accomplished all the goals we set out to in the beginning, and in just under a day and a half. I'd call that a win.
Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, but more importantly, I hope you're inspired to get out there and build something cool and solve a real-world problem yourself. If this content was interesting or useful to you at all, please check out the description, follow my other social medias, consider liking and subscribing, and also check out my Patreon. We've got some really cool stuff going to be coming down the line there, and when the time is right, I'd love your support. I'm Dustin from Bearhawk Studio, and we'll see you next time.